On October 30th, 2012, the entertainment world was shocked when it was announced George Lucas had sold his company Lucasfilm, including the Star Wars franchise, to Bob Iger and the Walt Disney Company. Naturally, Disney was eager to get a return on their investment and ordered several films, including the long-desired sequel trilogy, as well as several television shows for their upcoming streaming service Disney+. Reaction to most of these projects from critics and fans has been divisive, to say the least, leading some fans to look backwards and dive into the Star Wars Expanded Universe, the original continuity from 1977 to 2014 that told the stories of what happened in the Star Wars universe outside of the films. While many have found themselves simply enjoying what was and mourning what could have been, some have taken it a step further, asserting that these stories were the true George Lucas vision for Star Wars that Disney threw in the trash can for what many felt were inferior stories that were untrue to the creator. But is this really the truth? Was the expanded universe really the true version of Star Wars events as perceived by George Lucas? Let's peel back the mantle and take a look at the narrative. When I first started getting into this arena, initially I would see some fans throw out a quote or two suggesting the EU was never canon or that Lucas hated the EU, and some, who for simplicity's sake moving forward we'll dub EU purists, would fire back with some quotes suggesting the EU was absolutely canon and that Lucas cherished it. Initially, I thought this would be a pretty simple topic to address, but the further I dug, the more I realized that this was a really complex topic. So I wanted to make a comprehensive video addressing the situation and approaching it from several angles. But first, we'll have to lay out some of the common myths regarding the EU and what the truth really is, which we'll spend the rest of the video building the case for. So some myths. Myth number 1. The expanded universe was never considered canon. Period. The truth? The expanded universe was official Lucasfilm canon until 2014 when it was decanonized. I'm sorry, but there's no reality where this wasn't the case. If the EU wasn't canon for Lucasfilm, then they wouldn't have released a statement in 2014 decanonizing it. Prior to this, the official history of Star Wars, according to the company that owns it, was detailed in the films, the TV shows, and the publishing. Myth number 2. George Lucas had nothing to do with the EU and he hated it. The truth? George Lucas was vaguely involved with several major projects. He approved and vetoed major story concepts. He didn't keep up with the novels, but he read some of the comics and tended to enjoy them. I'm sorry for anyone who thinks he had nothing to do with the EU and avoided it like the plague, because that's not true. It's undeniable that he was involved. But what that involvement amounted to, we'll discuss later on. Myth number 3. George Lucas considered the EU the true continuation of the Star Wars films, and it was for the most part his vision for the future stories. The truth. George did not consider the EU as the true continuation. He considered the EU a separate thing from his films. All George counted was the films and the 2008 TCW series, and possibly the scripts for the cancelled Underworld series and his sequel trilogy treatments. So let's talk about George and the EU. George Lucas did not count the EU as part of his personal canon. He saw it as its own separate thing and emphasized this on multiple occasions over the last several years. The EU was something of an alternate universe from George's. The events of his canon were required to have happened in both universes, but the events of the EU were not required to have happened in his canon. George has stated clearly that the core pillars of EU stories did not happen in his version of the story. All of George's stories post-original trilogy, the prequel trilogy, the '08 TCW, which is the Clone Wars series, but we're going to call it TCW for abbreviation, and his sequel trilogy treatments have contradicted the EU elements to varying degrees. Now, this is a point where I'm sure a majority of the EU purists are either fuming or rolling their eyes hysterically at me. They're probably comforting themselves with the quotes and research they've already done. But don't worry, I know EU purists love their quotes, so I brought some of my own. Let's take a look at some of George Lucas's statements regarding the EU, since, after all, this is a video about his thoughts and not Lucasfilm's, which, yes, they are a separate thing, as strange as that might sound, but I'll explain later on. I've tried to keep it as chronological as I could. It's all in order of the year, but a lot of these I didn't have months or dates for, so there could be some minor variances in the chronology of all these. And just a disclaimer, there are some quotes here that I will be covering later, as I know you might think that I am keeping some of the information. I'm not. Some quotes, like the Splinter quote, I will address just a little later on in the video, because by then I'll have presented other information that will be helpful in addressing that. So please be patient, and don't click out right away if you see I forgot to bring up a quote. I also want to mention that all these quotes are genuine. I just decided to type them all out and format them instead of insert screenshots or photocopies from articles and videos because I thought it looked better and it was a personal preference. The text is accurate, and the sources and years are present for anyone who really wants to verify each and every one of these. And if there's something important to note, I make note of it. The first one was a quote to TV Guide in 2001. "Each time I do a trilogy, it's 10 years out of my life. I'll finish episode 3 and I'll be 60, and the next 20 years after that, I want to spend doing something other than Star Wars. If at 80 I'm still lively and having a good time and thinking I can work hard for another 10 years, between 80 and 90, I might consider it, but don't count on it. There's nothing written, and it's not like I'm completing something. I'd have to start from scratch." I think it's interesting that he mentions having to start from scratch on a sequel trilogy, even though by this point there had already been several EU novels. It's almost like he didn't count those as the true story. To be fair, the interviewer did bring those up. When told Star Wars sequels were written by novelists that continued the stories of the film characters, he said, "Oh sure, they're done outside my little universe." He seems to distinguish here between his timeline and the EU. Some might try to play semantics regarding the definition of the word universe, but if he really saw the EU as the true continuation, he would have simply said that was the true continuation, much in the way he refers to Star Wars 1 through 6 as the same story, even though they are 6 films across 2 trilogies, separated by almost 2 decades both in and out of universe. During an interview on Force.net, when asked, "Do you supervise the development of all off-movie stories? After all, Star Wars exists in the books and comics." George responded with, "I try not to think about that. I have my own world in movies, and I follow it." First off, he seems to suggest he really doesn't get involved in the development of the EU. And on top of that, he separates it from his own story. I've seen some suggest that by world, he is simply talking to the fact that it's other people controlling this as opposed to him. And maybe, but why keep it distinct like that? Why not just say, "No, I'm not really involved"? I think, as we'll see based off of later quotes we're going to discuss from both George and other Lucasfilm people, that world really does mean something along the lines of separate continuities, at least in most of the contexts he uses it in. To Cinescape, he said, "There are 2 worlds here. There's my world, which is the movies, and there's this other world which has been created, which I say is the parallel universe. The licensing world of the books, games, and the comic books. They don't intrude into my world, which is a selected period of time, but they do intrude between the movies. I don't get too involved in that parallel universe." Once again, he separates it. I know right off the bat people might object to me using this because of what else has been said about the use of the term parallel universe, but we'll address that when we talk about the rebuttals to the Starlog quote. When I talk about a parallel universe, I'm not talking about reality. I'm talking about something separate that is generally is similar but with some differences. George Lucas isn't an idiot. He knows science fiction. Why would he use this term if he didn't mean the EU was separate? The fact that he does so, I think, makes it clear his thoughts on the EU. Reported by Fury Conflict, as a TPM's The Phantom Menace screening, George was asked, "How much does the EU influence the movies?" The report described the response from Lucas. As I asked him, Lucas leaned back in a moment and said to me, "Very little." When he first had agreed to let people write EU books, he had said, "I'm not going to read them," and it was a different universe that he wanted to keep away from the time period of his saga. You could fight me on the semantics of the parallel all you want. The fact that he calls the EU a different universe, I think, again, makes clear his thoughts on the matter. At the same screening, George was asked, "What do you think of the EU books?" He replied, "The books are in a different universe. I've not read any of them, and I told them what they started writing, I wouldn't read any of them, and I blocked out certain periods. They couldn't touch where the real story happens." The question was followed up by asking about future TV stories. George replied, "I'm more open to TV product, but not more feature films. The story is complete, and any other story wouldn't be my philosophy and views. The books are not the same philosophy as the movies." I think this, again, makes it pretty clear. First off, before anyone jumps the gun, his comments about a TV show have no bearing on TCW because that didn't start becoming a thing for another couple of years. As for the rest of the quote, he says the story is complete. If the EU was the true continuation, why not simply say, there's more story in the books? Lucas could have made this a lot simpler if he really saw them as the same. The fact that he calls the books as not part of his philosophy is really interesting. I can't find the source for this next one, so take it as you will. I probably didn't spend more than 10 minutes trying to look, as I had a lot of other work to do, and the internet isn't forgiving with trying to find sources on long quotes with the day of Google's generative AI. If you want to disregard it, feel free. I don't think it changes the overall argument by removing it, but we'll talk about it anyway. The novels and the comic books are from other authors' interpretations of my creation. Sometimes I tell them what they can and can't do, but I just don't have the time to read them all. They're not my vision of what Star Wars is. If this is an accurate quote, then he quite clearly spells out they aren't his true vision of Star Wars. In a special editions interview, he said, referring to the books, "Those are another author's interpretation of what I've created, and not to be taken seriously, as far as what is really going on in the Star Wars world." Just like the last quote, this again spells it out very quickly and clearly that Lucas separated the EU from his canon. I mean, he says, don't take it seriously. During an interview with Cinefilms, the following exchange happened with the Bold being the interviewer. "I never really had a story for what happened after Return of the Jedi. But stories exist where we see Han and Leia getting married, have kids." Well, we're talking about two different things. There's my universe, the movie universe, and there's this other universe that's been created, a parallel universe, which is the licensing universe, with the books, the games, the comics, and it's separate. Again, Lucas definitively says it's separate, and he uses the term parallel universe, and says it's not his story for post-Return of the Jedi. In fact, I would say in this instance, he goes out of his way to shut down the notion that his canon includes the U, as opposed to leave it open-ended and ambiguous. He also makes a distinction between licensing and his, which is key for what we'll talk about throughout the video. During an MTV Universe exchange, a fan asked, "So if we'll never see it on screen, what does happen to Princess Leia and Han Solo after they fall in love?" And George responded, "Han and Leia probably did get married." Lucas conceded, "They settled down. She became senator, and they got a nice little house with a white picket fence. Han Solo is out there cooking burgers on the grill. Is that a movie? I don't think so." Sure, maybe this is a little bit of a joke, but this once again is key to showing this mentality on the books. He specifically was asked about any possible off-screen story for Han and Leia, since Lucas had stated by this point there won't be more films. There's no way purists could talk their way out of this one, because the question gives the opportunity to talk about off-screen material as something separate medium-wise from the films. Instead, Lucas ignores the books and talks about his hypothetical for their post-Return of the Jedi adventures. At Cannes, George was asked, "Have you ever felt throughout the years that the fans know even more than anyone else? You know, how geeky to some point they could become and the knowledge they have of all the details?" "Well, I interact with the fans, but at the same time, I don't know as much about the Star Wars as they do." It's funny, isn't it? It's a whole other world that people get excited about. They have created their own world. That's away from my world. I mean, it's connected to it, but it's their own world now. It's a whole other world. Again, twice here he separated it. And I ask why if they really are the same story. And him saying they're connected isn't him saying they're the same continuity. It's him saying the EU is bound by George as EU parameters have established. And now, at last, we get to the infamous Starlog quote. I'll preface this by saying if this was the only quote Lucas made about the EU, I would be willing to leave it out or roll with the other explanations. But because it's right in line with many other statements, I'm including it. And I know, there's some EU purist responses to this quote, and we'll absolutely address them towards the end of the video. I promise. I don't read that stuff. I haven't read any of the novels. I don't know anything about that world. That's a different world than my own. But I do try to keep it consistent. The way I do it now is they have a Star Wars encyclopedia. So if I come up with a name or something else, I look it up and see if it has already been used. When I said other people could make their own Star Wars stories, and we decided that, like Star Trek, we would have two universes. My universe, and then this other one. They try to make their universe as consistent with mine as possible, but obviously they get enthusiastic and want to go off in other directions. Again, he states a lot there. The EU goes off and does its own thing sometimes. It was going to be like Star Trek, where the off-screen aren't connected to the on-screen. There's a reason this quote gets used so much, because it's essentially Lucas's true thoughts wrapped up in a little blurb. To Total Film in 2008, he says, Howard tries to be consistent. Howard is the Lucasfilm licensing president. Howard tries to be consistent, but sometimes he goes off on tangents, and it's hard to hold him back. He once said to me that there are two Star Trek universes. There's the TV show, and then there's all the spin-offs. He said that these were completely different and didn't have anything to do with each other. So I said, okay, go ahead. And Lucas also said, and now, there have been novels about the events after Episode 6, which isn't at all what I would have done with it. The Star Wars story is really the tragedy of Darth Vader. That is the story. Once Vader dies, he doesn't come back to life, the Emperor doesn't get cloned, and Luke doesn't get married. A lot to unpack here. Again, Lucas iterates the EU was supposed to be separate like the Star Trek stuff. He then goes on to say that contrary to what the EU says, there isn't a story after Return of the Jedi. And two of the three things he listed off as not happening are core pillars of post-Return of the Jedi stories. And he would certainly know that. Why take a specific jab at the EU, especially with Luke's marriage, if it was all the same story and same continuity? Why say the Star Wars story does not include the elements of the EU if he saw them as the same? Maybe it's because he didn't see them as the same? We'll address the Emperor in more depth later on, but let's get going. To comingsoon.net, he said, but there's no story past Episode 6. There's just no story. It's a certain story about Anakin Skywalker, and once Anakin Skywalker dies, that's kind of the end of the story. There is no story about Luke Skywalker. I mean, apart from the books. But there's three worlds. There's my world that I made up. There's the licensing world, that's the books, comics, all that kind of stuff. The games, which is their world. And then there's the fans' world, which is also very rich in imagination. But they don't always mesh. Anyone who tries to say the terminology referencing the separation of EU and films, like world or separation, is simply semantics regarding who's overseeing the projects is refuted here, because he also calls the fans' world a world, something I am guessing is headcanon and fanfiction or the fan community, and that clearly isn't canon to Lucas's story, so if that is separate as far as continuity goes, then so too is the EU. Anyone still maintaining his usage of the words world or separate don't really mean a canonicity distinction can't really claim that anymore unless they need to say the world of the fans is also canon. Sure, Leland Chee has in future years after this said the EU and George's worlds are canon, but that's Leland's words, not George's, and we'll discuss more about that, especially when we hit the Starlog rebuttals. George clearly makes a distinction, and the usage of the world of the fans demonstrates the world of the EU is also something separate from George. To Star Wars Insider in 2008, he says, I am the father of our Star Wars movie world, the filmed entertainment, and the features, and now the animated film and television series. And I'm going to do a live action series. Those are all things I am very involved in. I set them up, and I train the people, and I go through them all. I am the father, that's my work. Then we have the licensing group, which does the games, toys, and books, and all that other stuff. I call that the son, and the son does pretty much what he wants. Once in a while, they ask a question like, can we kill off Yoda? Things like that, but it's very loose. Then we have the third group, the Holy Ghost, which is the bloggers and the fans. They have created their own world. I worry about the Father's world. The Son and the Holy Ghost can go their own way. If the Son can go their own way, then the continuity must not be tied together, otherwise the Son would have to stay in line with the Father. Notice also how he says the toys are on the same level as the EU stories? Are toys canon? Is the Jar Jar tongue lollipop canon? No? Then per this statement, neither is the EU. Also funny he says the Clone Wars is his and part of the movie world. We'll talk more about TCW later, but while fans seem to use the canon tiers to differentiate between the films and TCW, the tiers are a Lucasfilm creation, not Lucas creation, keep in mind. Lucas uses no such thing, and true George Lucas Star Wars fans would ignore the tier differentiation like he does. To the LA Times, he says, I get asked all the time, what happens after Return of the Jedi? And there really is no answer for that, he said. The movies were the story of Anakin and Skywalker and Luke Skywalker. And when Luke saves the galaxy and redeems his father, that's where the story ends. He's aware of the books. Why not simply say, go read about it? I mean, that would bring more profit to him. It doesn't take that much to say that. It's because in his mind, the EU is not the story post-Return of the Jedi. I haven't limited myself with what stories I've wanted to tell. This is Star Wars, and I don't make a distinction between the series and the films. It's just a different format and a different delivery. But the fact of the matter is that our improved processes for the stories have allowed us to tell consistently bigger stories. Our teams are constantly pushing the envelope so that the standard keeps raising itself higher and higher. And we keep asking for more than can be delivered. So we're always reaching and the show is always improving. Each week is a Star Wars feature, boiled down to 22 minutes. This one is interesting because, as we'll discuss later, he clearly owns TCW as his Star Wars and makes no tier distinction. And this is in 2011, the year Season 3 ended and Season 4 began. So it's not like it's right as the show is beginning. Here he is talking about TCW and how they are his stories and his Star Wars. What's funny is despite all the times he has differentiated between the films and the EU in the past, he is now standing his ground here and asserting that TCW is his Star Wars, something he actively did the opposite of multiple times with the EU. But enough of that. Let's take a look at some statements from others as they relate to George and the status of the EU as it related to him and his canon. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the channel. If you liked the video, comment down below and hit that like button. Oh, and check out some of my other videos. I'm sure you'll find them a delight.